back postal travel. Back. Welcome to another lunch with Jamie. Really excited. Remember, please turn your cameras on if you can. Love seeing all of you. This conversation couldn't be more timely as I've related to you guys. When I think about this idea of like muzzle velocity these days that Bannon threw out, and it's like every morning you wake up, you're just getting hit with so many different topics. You never know what's going to be the thing that's most topical. And I'm always trying to figure out guests that can help us with that. The judicial system is smack in the middle of that right now. And I have been trying to find the right person to talk to us. And Steve Vladeck is without a doubt the most important person that we could have to help us make sense, if he can make sense of what's going on. And I assume most of you are signed up for Steve's Substack called One First, but if you're not, please do. Please pay for it. We know that the news is under attack these days, and trying to get news is next to impossible. I personally sign up and pay for every Substack I can of anybody who is putting themselves out there doing work. It takes time, it takes effort. And if we want to get real information, real facts out to people, we need to support people like Steve. So I want to put a link in the chat, and please make sure you sign up and support him and share that with people. As most of you know, Steve is a law professor of Georgetown. He wrote a book called The Shadow Docket. And shockingly, he's a Mets fan, which is maybe the most confusing part about him.
We're 7-3, Jamie. Just putting that out there.
I know you can't make that Mets joke as much anymore. It used to be such an easy joke to make. Now they're actually good. So, but Steve, before we get into the meat of our conversation, I am a foodie first and foremost, and I gotta get a little bit of your DC favorite restaurants these days. So could you give me one or two places that you love, or that if I was coming to DC, where would you take me?
So I'm embarrassed to say, Jamie, we have two little kids. And so my favorite restaurant is any place that will make them plain pasta with butter and cheese. Um, but, not that long ago, Karen and I were Rose's Luxury fans. We were pretty close to Aaron and BJ when they launched Rose's Luxury about 12 years ago. So, that sort of universe. The new Minetta Tavern, which I know is just a New York transplant, but we've really enjoyed our meals there. So when we can get out, which is seldom, some of the old haunts, I think.
Well, you had me at Rose's Luxury. I think what they do and at Maidon is pretty amazing.
Yep.
All right. Well, it's hard to find things that are more important than what we should be eating, but we're gonna try. So let's start off where you ended. Probably late last night or early this morning with today's Substack. It's really at the center of what's the most topical issue, which is the Alien Enemies Act right now. So for the few people who didn't read this morning's issue, I'd love for you to just give us a sense of where this case stands and what you're expecting later today or in the coming days. And again, just thank you for being here and joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So, to sort of make a lot of really long stories short, so President Trump has used the Alien Enemy Act to remove somewhere around 275 Venezuelans from the United States to El Salvador. So there were these two different orders that had been issued in the same case by Judge Boasberg in DC. Those orders are now gone. I mean, those are the orders that the Supreme Court's decision last night gets rid of, which means at least, Jamie, as we're sitting here, there's no judicial ruling stopping the Trump administration from using the Alien Enemy Act. There's language in last night's decision that says going forward, if the administration wants to remove anyone under the Alien Enemy Act, it has to provide them with notice, and it has to provide them with an opportunity to challenge their removal in a federal court. And so we might see some of those cases coming soon. But, for the folks who have already been removed, Jamie, now we have this question of what happens to them. Can they be brought back? Can the federal courts order the government to take whatever steps it can to get them back? And that's really now an issue in a different case called Abrego Garcia, which is before the Supreme Court right now. This is the guy who was removed by accident, who is now trying to get back into the United States. A district judge in Maryland had ordered that the government bring him back by 11:59 p.m. yesterday. But Chief Justice Roberts, yesterday afternoon, right before the Alien Enemy Act ruling, had issued a temporary pause of that decision. And so, we expect the full Supreme Court to rule on whether the government has to bring this guy back. Jamie, maybe today, probably in the next couple of days. And that's going to have a lot to say, not just about this poor guy, Abrego Garcia, but about the folks who have already been removed under the Alien Enemy Act as well.
Thank you for that, and thank you for laying it out so clearly. I'm not I was a political science major, but my legal expertise is minimal. I had one question that I was sort of putting towards the end of this chat, but I think I'm going to just move it up to the front because I think it's the most important one, which is, we're living in a world right now, which I assume that you don't teach in your law classes regularly, which is what do you do when the executive branch doesn't follow these rulings? And I've heard you talk about the one or two times in the history of America where a president didn't abide by one of the rulings, but those were in slightly different situations. How do you sort of lay out and look at the future when you're not 100% sure that the executive branch is going to follow the rulings in the courts?
Yeah, it's a big question. So I think the short version is the first piece is to really make clear to everybody, including, frankly, the executive branch, just how dire the consequences would be if that happened. Right. And so it's not just about the president not following a court in one case. Jamie, the federal government depends upon the federal courts every day, whether it's for criminal prosecutions, for civil enforcement actions, for tax cases. I mean, right there's a universe of ways in which the federal government really cannot afford to get into a war with the courts. Because even if Trump says in one case, I'm not going to comply with your mandates, there are all these ways in which the courts can fight back. I mean, a lot of folks online say, well, the president controls the Marshal Service. That's true. But the president doesn't control state bars, which can go after all of the lawyers in these cases. And the president can't make the judges hear the cases the federal government wants them to hear. So I think part of the story for me is about making clear to everybody just how sort of complicated and multifaceted presidential defiance actually would be because of the repercussions it would provoke. If we get there, right, and I think there are reasons why we haven't gotten there yet, then I think the question is that the red line for enough Republican members of Congress? Is that the point at which, we see not even a majority of Republicans, but just, a handful, because that's all it would take in the House and the Senate to form majorities with the Democrats. Where now we're talking about impeachment. Where now we're talking about other steps to thwart the president's agenda as sort of retribution, as a lever. Because, if that's not the red line, Jamie, I don't know what is. So, I think that's how I try to think about the conversation. I also think it's worth noting that even though we have lots of examples of the administration sort of slow walking compliance with court orders and, in the Alien Enemy Act case, trying to sort of dance around whether or not it did or did not have to comply with that court order. It's striking to me that actually we don't see the president saying, I don't have to comply with this. And it's striking to me that we don't see, sort of outright defiance. It's almost as if it's better from the government's perspective to have this plausible deniability that, they're not complying. Which I think drives home to that even the White House understands just what kind of Rubicon it would cross, right, to take that step.
Right. Are you surprised at these acts that they're taking right now? I mean, are you shocked?
Um, I am surprised by some of this. I mean, a lot of it was in Project 2025, which, I read. I guess what I'm surprised by, Jamie, is not what they're doing. I'm surprised at the lack of pushback from really any Republicans in power. I would have thought that some of these moves would have already been the red line. So completely arrogating Congress's appropriations power. I would have thought that someone like Tom Cole, the Oklahoma congressman who's the chair of the House Appropriations Committee, would be a little worried about, the president basically taking over his job. And instead, Representative Cole's response was, well, appropriations aren't laws in the first place, which, by the way, is not true. So I guess I'm not surprised. what they're doing, I'm surprised at how sort of few roadblocks they've encountered. And it's part of why, Jamie, we've seen so many, head-on confrontations between the president and the courts, because that's been it. Right? In any other administration, a president who tried to do even half of the things that Trump is trying to do would have met with such political pushback, within his own party, from Congress, from sort of other institutions, that, yeah, there would have been litigation too, but Jamie, the litigation would not have been the full story. Whereas here, we really are all, or at least, those of us who are sort of paying attention to the courts are sort of like desperately following each case because that really is all we have. And I think the best evidence of that is how much Trump and his supporters are attacking the courts. Because they too, I think, understand that the courts are at the moment the principal thing standing in their way of accomplishing what they want to accomplish.
Were you the going back to the Alien Enemies Act for a minute? Were you I've heard this argument that, the people who were deported, didn't deserve due process. And why do you think that's kind of fundamentally flawed? Obviously, from kind of a moral perspective, it's clear, but what are the
Yeah.
legal ramifications of that? And why do you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, so Stephen Miller even, I think, tweeted at one point, right? Illegal immigrants are not entitled to due process. And, my best response to that, first of all, they are. But even if that weren't true, how do we know they're illegal immigrants? Right? I mean, due process is what allows any of us to have confidence that when the government points to someone and says they are a member of MS-13 or they are a member of Tren de Aragua, um, that's actually correct. And so, Jamie, I spent a lot of time in my law school classes, partly because I teach civil procedure, which is the basic first year process heavy class, trying to help my students understand how you can have sharp disagreements on what the substantive policies should be and sharp disagreements about what the substantive laws even are, and still think that due process is essential to reducing the risk of error, and to actually ensuring that the policies the government actually has are carried into place correctly, right? And not just as sort of whether through malice, Jamie, or just negligence, not through mistakes.
Yeah, seems so clear. Trump,
I would have thought so.
yeah. So it was, Trump's floated this idea that, some judges are bad judges, some judges are rogue judges, and
Yeah.
and Mike Johnson even talked about this idea that Congress has the ability to eliminate entire district courts. Is that actually possible? And conceptually, help me understand Trump's thought here, or logic, or rationale.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I don't, again, I don't think it's surprising that in the face of an unprecedented number of rulings blocking his policies, right, that Trump is lashing out at the courts. Congress does have a lot of power over the lower federal courts, so federal district courts and federal courts of appeals. Um, it can't make these judges go away. I mean, that's what judicial independence is about. But it could, I mean, Jamie, if you really passed a statute through both chambers and the president signed it, you could pay these judges to do very little, right? You could take cases away from particular lower courts. What is striking about this conversation is both how like shamelessly hypocritical it is when we look back at what litigation looked like during the Biden administration, for example, when, challengers to Democratic policies um, didn't sort of go after, nationwide lawsuits. They filed in like a small handful of very carefully picked courthouses in Amarillo, Texas, or Lake Charles, Louisiana, or Victoria, Texas, where they could handpick the judges and get the same nationwide relief. So part of it's hypocrisy. But Jamie, at a broader level, this is not a handful of judges who are ruling against Trump. I mean, my research assistant and I, put together the data as of, I think it's now, gosh, 10 days ago. Um, and 10 days ago, you had 46 cases in which federal judges had ruled against Trump policies. Those 46 cases came from 39 different district judges sitting in 11 different district courts in 7 different circuits. And so, when Trump says it's the judges, I say, well, maybe it's the policies. Right? I don't remember whose line it is, but there's the old line about the guy who says, everyone at work is an asshole. My boss is an asshole. My assistant's an asshole. My coworker's an asshole. And the friend says, maybe you're the asshole. Um, right? Like, this is the problem with this argument is that, we have federal courts for the purpose of holding the executive branch to account. And when the president loses in lower courts, the remedy, as Chief Justice Roberts himself said a couple weeks ago, right, is not to attack the judges. It's not to call them rogue judges. It's not to impeach the judges. It's just to appeal.
Yeah. I've listened to some of these 3 hour podcasts and I'm sorry, how can you talk about something for 3 hours? We might be here for 3 hours. A handful of people are talking about these issues related to these law firms that are sort of, I'll use the term of the moment, the bending the knee to Trump. Um, I'm curious, is anything like this happened before? And B, uh, are you obviously you're surprised. I keep asking that question. We're surprised. I guess we're not surprised about anything anymore, but are you, what do you think we're gonna see happen going forward in relationship to those situations? Do you see more firms doing that? And then in addition, how can people push back in your mind, and what are
Yeah.
you suggesting people to do?
Um, so I find the law firm stuff really, really serious. And I mean, I'm a lawyer and I'm a law professor, so I'm naturally inclined to find that particular slice of the story especially significant. But part of why I find it so serious is because courts are reactive institutions, right? Judges don't go out and find cases, the cases are brought to them. And we have pro se litigants in our legal system. We have the ability for people to bring lawsuits on their own. But realistically, law firms are a bulwark because they're often in the best position to bring the kinds of lawsuits you need. Jamie, not for one-off misconduct by the executive branch, but for systemic misconduct, right? That's really where you need firms with resources and reputations and experience in these kinds of spaces. And, it's not just my view. I mean, the Supreme Court has a case from 2001 called Legal Services Corporation versus Velasquez, where the court struck down a statute that had purported to bar the Legal Services Corporation, which gives out money to folks to represent indigent clients. So Congress had tried to say, you can't take the money we give you and then sue to challenge statutes we've enacted. And the Supreme Court said, well, no, you can't do that, Congress, right? Like the lawyer's job is to make good faith arguments under the law. And, we depend upon that as much as they do. So that's what I lose sleep over with all of the sort of threatening of law firms, which is it seems like a pretty transparent attempt, not just to retaliate against these firms for constitutionally protected conduct, but to chill them and to scare them and to cow them into submission. And so, what I'm surprised by, Jamie, is less that Trump is trying this. I'm surprised at the firms that have caved. Um, and, I'll say that my surprise has come in sort of two different waves. I was surprised at the first round of caving by Paul Weiss, et cetera. But I was even more surprised by what we're seeing now. I mean, now we've seen a handful of firms very publicly fight back, right? We've seen Perkins Coie not just sue the Trump administration, but actually, have Paul Clement, the former George Bush Solicitor General, represent them, right? We've seen Jenner and Block sue the administration. We're seeing Covington sue the administration, right? The fact that there are firms after this, after we've seen big name law firms pushing back that are still, to use your phrase, bending the knee, I think is even more alarming to me because I would have thought that once there was, enough noise about pushing back, once there was enough attention to the firms that were pushing back, that would have given more of a backbone to the firms that were wavering. And the fact that it hasn't, I think, is actually, you know, I don't think it's like a five alarm fire because I think that the firms that are pushing back are doing a really good job. And I think that, establishing legal precedents that Trump can't do this will benefit all these firms. But I mean, it's really disappointing to me that there are firms that are putting, their what they claim is their fiduciary obligations to their clients ahead of, their responsibility to the rule of law, which is something all lawyers have. And that might be easy for me to say as a law professor, but I think it's something that has not gotten enough pushback and enough conversation, right, in this debate.
And I guess the follow-up would be, why do you think they're doing it? Why has it not gotten
Yeah.
attention? And then the final thing, you have people calling their representatives when they're upset about things. I mean, should people be flooding the phone lines of these firms? And I mean, what should people be doing to really push back? And is there a way to do a pushback?
So let me answer those questions in order to the why it's happening. So take a firm like Paul Weiss. I'm going to make up some numbers, but I don't think that these are wildly off. So assume that Paul Weiss, which is principally a deal-making firm at this point, not a litigation firm, assume that like 9 of their top 10 partners, by terms of how much revenue they're bringing to the firm, um, tell the executive committee that if they fight Trump, the partners are going to walk, right? Because they have clients, and the clients can't afford to be represented in, regulatory proceedings or before administrative agencies by a firm that's perceived to be hostile to Trump. Right? So I can understand, if that's the story, why a firm like Paul Weiss even thinks it's a close call, right, about whether to, make a deal or not. Um, I still think that you can't put, sort of fidelity to the rule of law against dollar signs, right? Like these are not things that can be compared to each other. And my hypothetical 9 partners who are going to bolt to another firm. Well, if there's no firm for them to bolt to, right? If all of the other firms that they would otherwise go to, have Paul Weiss's back, um, then the story is different. And so I think some of this is a first mover problem, some of this is a collective action problem, some of it's a problem that law firms don't have their own professional association that can sort of do all of this on their behalf. Um, but I think that's part of the conversation that has gotten us to this point, even if I still would have hashed out those values differently. Um, as for what folks can do, I mean, those of us who are in a position to send work to law firms should be going out of our way to send work to the firms that are fighting back. And indeed, to make the point that like we are hiring you because you are fighting, and we want, if we have bet the company litigation, or if we have even a relatively modest case that we're dealing with, or if we are on the board of a nonprofit, like we want fighters for our lawyers. Obviously not all of us are in a position to do that, but just sort of the more we can express support publicly, privately, through our business, however, for the firms that are doing this. And the more that we can not support the firms that are not doing this, I think that's a message that will resonate. I mean, I'll just say, I am very good friends with the managing partner of the DC office of one of the firms that is fighting, and it has been enormously useful for that firm that they've gotten some new, pretty significant clients in the last couple of weeks, at least partly because they are visibly fighting. Right? More of that.
I don't have business to throw them, but maybe they can send them all some like donuts or something to thank them.
Donuts, coffee. I mean, everyone takes their fuel in different ways, but just I think it's just the more that it becomes like these firms are doing good and those firms are not. Right. The more that you'll be encouraging other firms that have to make this decision to make what, at least to me, is the right decision.
Well, not to give you more work, but I'd love to see the kind of naughty and nice list from these in the law firm. So if you can point me to the direction to find that, or where we can track that, I think that's helpful, and people should be aware of it. And it does actually seem like something that's relatively easy to do. Again, whether you're just sending a nice handwritten note or you're actually sending some real business, I'm sure both will go a long way. I want to do go through a little bit of a sort of thought experiment with you and get ourselves out of the nonstop news for a second. And the irony is that when I first started reaching out to you and some other people about coming on to talk about the courts and the Supreme Court, it was when Joe Biden was in office. And so obviously none of these topics were a part of what I wanted to talk about. And what I really wanted to talk about was the Supreme Court and the makeup of the Supreme Court. And we have been talking and hearing about all these different things about how the court should be rethought, and should we add people? Should we, what should be done? Term limits. So
Yeah.
what I would love you to do for a second is imagine we're in a situation where the court, you are able to completely remake the court right now. You have the magic pen. You have that big marker that Donald Trump signs everything in. You have that marker and you can
I'm sending the hurricane to Alabama.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Um, and you can create the new Supreme Court that's going to be the law of the land going forward. What would your court
Yeah.
look like?
Whew. That's a lot of power. Um, so, you know, let me give you sort of my academic answer to that question as opposed to my, I live in a world where I want things to be different answer to that question. Um, I think that the principal problem with the Supreme Court we have today, and I thought this during the Biden administration, and I think it's very true today as well, is that we have a Supreme Court, Jamie, that to a degree we've never seen before, is not and does not think it ought to be accountable to the other institutions of government. Right? We've had 6-3 conservative majorities before. We've had courts that were hostile to precedent before. We've had bad actors on the court before. I mean, there's a justice who wouldn't even be in the same room with Justice Brandeis because he was such a virulent anti-Semite. Like, we got through all of those prior periods because we also had a court that was in constant dialogue with the other branches of government. Congress controlled the court's docket. Congress controlled the court's budget. I mean, Congress used to use pensions as a cudgel to get justices off the court when they wanted to. There are a couple statutes Congress passes to actually like entice, you might even say bribe specific justices to retire in the late 19th and early 20th century. Jamie, there were so many ways that Congress used to nudge the court, not to sort of rule in particular ways in particular cases. I think that would be a problem, but sort of to not get too out of, kilter, to not get too out of line with the mainstream. Paul Freund, who's a great con law professor at Harvard, had this quote that I love. He said, justices should be oblivious to the weather of the day, but they should be attuned to the climate of the age. Meaning, right, like the judicial independence means ruling in any one case without fear of the direct political ramifications to you, but behaving as an institution in conversation with other institutions of government. And Jamie, we have gotten so far out of line from that. I mean, Justice Alito had a quote in the Wall Street Journal in July 2023 that I couldn't believe. He said, I want to get this right. I realize this is a controversial position, but I'm willing to say it anyway. No provision in the Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate the Supreme Court, period. Um, that's literally false. I mean, Article 3, Section 2, Clause 2 literally says Congress can make regulations to the Supreme Court's appellate jurisdiction. But forget that it's literally false. It's the mindset, Jamie, that they can do whatever they want without worrying about Congress, passing new statutes or reigning in their jurisdiction or, messing with the budget. So if I could, start over, I would actually use the model we had for the better part of 175 years, which was a Supreme Court that did lots of bad stuff because, justices are insulated from doing what we want them to do at every second. But an institution that was actually super responsible in not getting too far afield from where the mainstream political discourse was. And Jamie, in the few moments where the court really did, there was pushback. I mean, Reconstruction and 1937. There are actually powerful examples, right, of the court sort of course correcting because of public pressure. So more than any one particular reform, like that's what I think is missing, and that's what I would want to bring back, which is the court doing its job while looking over its shoulder, to agree that it just doesn't today.
I'm gonna push back on you, Steve. You need to
Good.
remake the court. How many justices do we have? Do we have term limits? What are the other rules that you would impose?
Okay. So if we're doing this totally from scratch, right? So I want 13 justices because we have 13 federal appeals courts, right? And I want to require that each justice come from the geographic domain of those appeals courts, which was a norm we actually used to follow which would ensure geographic diversity on the court, something we never had before. Jamie, I want a professional diversity on the court. I want some non-lawyers up there. We had some of the most effective justices in the court's history were not trained lawyers; they were politicians. Um, Jamie, I want term limits, not because I think that they're actually like this amazing salve to everything, but because I think if you had 18-year term limits with staggered appointments every 2 years, we would not have this push to appoint 45-year-olds to the court. Right? That we'd be more content with 55 and 60-year-olds. Right? And I think that would also create more stability with regard to the sort of when the court's going to turn over. Um, I mean, there are lots of other things I would do. I would have Congress control more of the court's docket. So, this is sort of a nerdy point that I think a lot of folks don't appreciate. Until 1891, the Supreme Court had zero control over its docket. The court had to hear all of the cases Congress told it to hear. Um, that has totally flipped over so that today the court has almost complete control over its docket. Guys, it's not hard to figure out why a court that can sit back and pick the cases it wants is going to pick cases that, folks who are not aligned with the current majority are going to hate, versus having to decide the cases that the other branches tell you to decide. It's a very different thing. So, Jamie, I guess to sort of take a half step back, there are lots of democracies that divide the functions of what we might call a Supreme Court of Appeals, the court that has to go last for the sake of uniformity, from a constitutional court. Right? For better or for worse, our Constitution blends those functions together. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but it has to be sort of moderated and policed so that the court doesn't skew too far toward one or the other. So if I were in charge, that's where I would try to get us back to, is a court that was in a better, more stable, more predictable equilibrium, where, to quote Freud again, right, the justices could be immune from the weather of the day, but couldn't ignore, right, the climate of the era. And I think the problem right now is that we have justices who think that they're immune from everything.
I love that. And for next semester, I'd like to see your, the recreation of the Supreme Court class, and please share the findings with it. It's wild when you hear things that are so logical and make so much sense, but just aren't being implemented. And I think, some of the things you just mentioned are that way. And it's sort of shocking when you hear just that idea that Congress used to decide the docket. I mean, that makes total sense. I mean, the idea that that's not the case is preposterous. Now, it never once crossed my mind because that's not something I've studied. So, uh, one of the things that I've been surprised by, and I guess a little less now than prior, is that, Trump at this point has 3 justices on the court. Although it seemed that there have been a handful of times, and maybe more than not, where the courts ruled against Trump and or his sort of MAGA, principles, or is that fair to say? And have you been surprised by the justices he has appointed?
Um, I think it's fair to say. I mean, I think it's having this conversation today makes me a little more circumspect because of last night's ruling in the Alien Enemy Act case and Friday night's ruling in the teacher training case. I guess what I would say is, and I'm going to overgeneralize a bit, but I think this will be helpful. I think that you could largely sort most of the judges and justices on the federal courts today who have been appointed by Republican presidents into 2 loose categories. And for lack of a more sophisticated term, I'll call them Trump judges and Bush judges. Right? And the key is which category you're in does not depend upon who appointed you, right? It depends upon, are you sort of a classic establishment conservative, who came up with the Federalist Society in the 1970s and 1980s, right? Who's committed to sort of the consistent, coherent principles of the conservative legal movement? Or are you a more populist, do whatever Trump wants type of judge? And Jamie, that's a little bit unfair, but I'm generalizing. I think of the 6 Republican appointees on the court right now, I think there are probably 4 who I think of as, pretty Trumpy. maybe three and a half, and two and a half who are more Bushy. Right. So I think, Thomas and Alito, I think, are actually the closest thing we have to Trump judges on the Supreme Court. Um, I think Gorsuch, except for the handful of issues where his libertarian sensibilities prevail, has been remarkably Trumpy insofar as what he has and has not cared about and how he's ruled. And frankly, I think Justice Kavanaugh has been at least a little Trumpier than certainly Justice Kennedy would have been. Um, and in contrast, I think the Chief Justice and Justice Barrett really are more in the classical Bush mold, which, is, I think, maybe not surprising for Roberts and maybe a little more surprising for Barrett. But I think, we have, I think, already memory hold the political circumstances of both, Kavanaugh's appointment and Barrett's, right? I mean, Kavanaugh was basically, whether Justice Kennedy specifically said, I'll only retire if you nominate Kavanaugh, or whether it was just a sort of much more subtle message, right? Kavanaugh was the intended successor to Kennedy. And, Barrett was the only really obvious choice given the moment that Trump had, the brief moment he had when Justice Ginsburg died. And so, my own view is that when we look at all of the big cases the Supreme Court has today, we're at a point now where the most likely fourth vote to go along with the Democratic appointees in ruling against President Trump is Justice Barrett. And that really it's the chief who's become the median again. And, there will be cases, I'm sure, where Kavanaugh also rules against Trump, but it's really hard to believe that there will be cases where he's the fifth vote against Trump versus the sixth. And I think that gets back to the sort of the difference between who are the sort of the Bush Republicans and who are the Trump Republicans.
Right, that makes sense. Um, obviously we're drinking from this fire hose of just sort of chaos in the courts and decisions that appear to be pretty awful. What have there been any decisions, in the last couple of weeks, or things that have kind of given you some hope about some of the cases, or some of whether it is in the Supreme Court or the federal courts, any courts that you're seeing? What's making you kind of feel good about the courts today?
I mean, I will say I have been really heartened by the reaction in the lower federal courts to a lot of what we're seeing. I mean, I know, especially for the folks who are not lawyers or law adjacent, it seems like litigation is slow. It seems like the courts aren't moving fast enough. It seems like their powers are limited. And I'll just say that I think, compared to any other presidency in American history, we are seeing a more aggressive, more sustained, and faster pushback by the federal courts than we've seen ever before. There are, Jamie, I think, some baked in limits on what the courts can do, but we're seeing, judges appointed by both Republican and Democratic presidents all over the country, ruling against a bunch of these policies. The complication is that when the Trump administration is seeking, what the lawyers call emergency relief, basically to sort of not to conclusively resolve the case, but to have the status quo favor the government while the case goes forward. So far the Supreme Court has been more acquiescent than I would have thought. And so, Friday night the court put back into effect, the ruling in the teacher training grants case. Saturday, right, or sorry, yesterday the court ruled in the alien enemy case. So, Jamie, I'm heartened by what's happening in the lower federal courts. I think we're still in the middle of figuring out where the U.S. Supreme Court's going to end up in the run of these cases. And at least at the moment, the court is, I think, doing more to let these policies go forward without actually blessing them than I at least would have preferred.
We all just watched the Wisconsin Supreme Court race unfold. And despite Elon Musk trying to buy the election, ultimately the more liberal judge, Susan Crawford, won. What do you think some of the implications of that race are?
I think the Wisconsin race is, a positive sign from the perspective of both, sort of um, what that will mean, for example, if like the presidential election in 2024 is super close in Wisconsin. I think it's also a really positive sign that there was this real resistance to, Elon Musk's attempt to really throw all of his money behind the Republican candidate and have that succeed. Um, we're at a point, Jamie, where state courts are really, really important. Um, perhaps more so than we are used to when we talk about the role of the courts in our system, partly because the Supreme Court has become such a, I think, sort of more regressive institution. And so I guess the Democrat in me takes some solace out of what happened in Wisconsin. The sort of the federal courts nerd in me is just generally happy that state courts are getting more time in the spotlight and that everyone is paying more attention to how we choose state court judges as well as federal court judges, because there's a heck of a lot of really important stuff that they do as well. It's also part of why what's happening in North Carolina right now is, I think, so significant. We have a sort of the North Carolina intermediate state court trying to basically um, meddle in the election for the swing justice on the North Carolina Supreme Court. Um, these elections matter for better or worse in those states that elect their judges. And I think the more we're paying attention, I'll just say it, I think that's a net positive no matter what the results are.
Yeah, I was was the idea of Democratic justices and Republican justices a new idea? I mean, it sounds insane as I say it out loud. But when did that start occurring? Was it just liberal and conservative originally? Is that sort of the new words for it, basically?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it, Jamie. I think also, I mean, the parties have sorted, right, in a way that they used to. I mean, not that long ago, we would talk about conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. There's a great graphic that shows sort of if you plot every member of the House on like an ideological spectrum in the 1960s and 70s, there's actually a ton of, crisscrossing in the middle. And it just starts sorting and sorting and sorting. And I think that the same thing has happened to judges that, we had, I mean, some of the most impactful so-called liberal justices in the 20th century were Republicans, or at least were Republican appointees. Earl Warren was a Republican, right? William Brennan was appointed by a Republican. Um, David Souter, John Paul Stevens, Harry Blackmun, all Republican appointees. So I think part of what happens, Jamie, is like as the parties have sorted, um, the judges have followed suit. So that now, right, as opposed to the old days where you wouldn't just say, oh, there were 4 Democrats and 5 Republicans, right? Now liberal and Democrat means not the same thing, but describes the same subset of people. The way that conservative and Republican, again, although it doesn't mean the same thing, describes the same subset. It's only, Jamie, since 2010, only since Justice Kagan was appointed to replace Justice Stevens, that we have seen the Supreme Court for the first time have the ideology of the justices mapped perfectly onto the party of the president who appointed them. And I'll just say, I think in the long term, that's not great. I think I understand why we now all are so into labeling, but we should not think lesser of a judicial ruling just because it's from a judge who was appointed by the wrong president, right? We should assess the judges on their own merits and demerits, because there are great judges appointed by presidents of both parties, and there are bad judges appointed by presidents of both parties. And the more we can be nuanced about that, I think the better.
Yeah, I'd love to live in a world where you could vote for a Democrat, vote for a Republican, where you just could have, thought about what made the most sense, and we weren't stuck with these labels, and everybody was crisscrossing in the middle. And I don't know, we'll see. Maybe there's a world where we get back to that.
I mean, Jamie, I would have thought that like some of the challenges we're facing right now should have been prime examples of that, right? I mean, I would have thought that the notion that, individuals are entitled to due process before they can be disappeared into a Salvadoran prison would not divide us into Democrats and Republicans, right? I would have thought that, the president arrogating the appropriations power to himself would not divide us into Democrats and Republicans. And, I think it's unfortunate. I mean, I guess the question is like, how do we, the lawyers especially, try to make the case for that? And that's why I think starting from the notion that like we should be invested in these kinds of rule of law values, regardless of the specific results they produce, and regardless of whether, an R or a D wins, I think it has to be part of this conversation.
Right. After everybody has signed up and paid for your Substack, then they're going to go and buy your book, Shadow Docket, in that order, everybody. But Can you talk a little bit and give people a little bit of the cliff notes of your book and what this sort of idea of the shadow docket means and these decisions that are being made that we're not really aware of?
Sure. I mean, I think, we're aware of them now because, that's all we're getting in the news this week. So I did not coin the term. Will Bode, who's a common law professor at the University of Chicago, coined the term in 2015, the shadow docket. He did not mean it pejoratively. He meant it as this like evocative shorthand, really just to describe like everything the Supreme Court does other than the 60 or 65, big decisions and argued cases where we get the big long rulings in May and June. And Will's insight was that 99% of what the Supreme Court does comes through unsigned and usually unexplained orders, Jamie, through technical stuff that is not unimportant. It's just technical. And so, I've been, really sort of resolved to try to help folks understand where these came from, like how the power to use these orders, was both given to and then taken by the court. How it has evolved, Jamie, and like what's different about the way that the court does this today versus 20, 30, 40 years ago. And it's radically different, really, since 2017. And frankly, why we should be bothered by this. It's not the results in any of these cases. But like, look at last night, right? So the Supreme Court writes maybe 2.5 pages to resolve a really complicated dispute over whether challenges to the use of the Alien Enemy Act have to be brought through habeas petitions, through individual cases brought by individual detainees, or whether they can be brought by, sort of these large-scale class-wide organizations. That's a huge question. The Supreme Court did not receive briefing, like full briefing on it. The Supreme Court did not have oral argument on it. The justices resolved it in about 4 days. Whatever you think of the results, the sort of the basic thesis is that it's not healthy for our legal system for the court to be doing more and more big stuff through these unsigned and underexplained, if not unexplained rulings. And indeed, it's actually a symptom of this broader disease of a court that just doesn't think it has to explain itself, right? So that's the basic gist of the book, is trying to help folks sort of understand enough about these nerdy technical things that not even, I think, many lawyers fully understand, so that they can, have facility in understanding what's problematic about what the court's doing, separate and apart from the bottom lines of the orders it's handing down.
Got it. Well, thank you for writing that book, and it's must reading for everybody who's curious about this topic. I'm going to go to a question from the audience. Caroline Klimchuk has a great question that I'd like her to ask.
Hi, this is fascinating. My question is that obviously, as we all know, trust in institutions is at an all-time low. Why should the American public have faith in the Supreme Court when, it often seems pretty nakedly corrupt? And to your point about sort of the nature of the day, I would argue, not to be a pessimist, but the nature of the day seems, opportunism and nihilism. How can we rebuild and shore up faith in, our institutions?
It's a big question. So I guess I'll start with, I am probably up there in like visible critics of the Supreme Court. And I criticize the court a lot because I think it has an obligation to build institutional faith, right? I think part of its job is not just to do what 5 justices think the law is, but actually to build public faith in the court's credibility writ large, entirely because the court depends upon us to carry its mandates into effect, right? The court doesn't have an army. It depends upon public and political pressure for folks to comply with its rulings. So why should we have faith? I guess, I would go back to the Russian proverb that Reagan stole, right? Trust but verify. We shouldn't have blind faith. The court needs to earn our faith. But, not everything the court does can be chalked up to nihilism and cynicism. Right. So, the first 2 rulings the court handed down in Trump cases were both, modest losses, but losses for Trump, in the Hampton Dellinger case and the USAID funding case. I think before we're done, even this week, Trump's going to lose a couple of the other pending emergency cases, including the birthright citizenship case. Right. if you want to go back a little further, I mean, the court had opportunities in 2020 to throw the election to Trump, and it didn't. That may seem like a very small, thin reed on which to hang, but I think, these are all signs that the court is doing at least what the justices view as law and not just politics. And maybe they're not drawing the legal lines where I or you would want them to, but they're still doing something other than just pure politics. And to me, I want to make the case for why they should be doing more of that, and why it's important and incumbent upon them to do more of that. And I think part of that starts with having a conversation about the court that is not just, Dobbs bad, Obergefell good, right? But that is actually about like the court as an institution. How is it weakened as an institution? How can we strengthen it? Why should it be strengthened? And the more that we can find ways in which the court is part of that story, I think the better. So, I don't want to sort of sugarcoat this. I think the court has done plenty in the last few years to undermine public faith. I just think that one, we shouldn't give up all hope. And two, one of the ways in which we can push the court to care about this stuff is to help everyone understand why we need a court that is generally credible, right? We need a court that, I mean, why did Nixon turn over the Watergate tapes, right? The short answer is because the Supreme Court ordered him to. The real answer is because if he had defied the Supreme Court, he was guaranteed to be convicted in the Senate, right? We need a court that has that kind of support, even from the president's own party in Congress. And so this is why it's so important to me to be going out and talking to people about like the court in institutional terms and not just, the Republicans versus the Democrats. And that's why I think, that's where we start. And I think that's the conversation that we have to be having, even as we're focused on the individual rulings in the moment.
Great. That was great. Great question. Great answer. I'm going to go to one more question from Greg Chernak. Oh, sorry, Greg, you're muted. 1 second.
Am I off now?
Yes.
Great. Steve, good to see you again.
You too, Greg.
Thank you for doing this. I'm curious on a more specific issue, how last night's ruling is going to impact Judge Boasberg's show cause hearing. Can that move forward? I know the government filed something last night saying it's all moot now. Normally that seems to be wrong. And I'm also more broadly curious on the idea of the bar itself to take action against some of these lawyers that are taking positions either misstating things or well beyond that, and whether you think that's a possibility.
All right, let me take this in order. So on the very specific question, so the sort of the gravamen of last night's ruling is that the substance of the Alien Enemy Act case, right, should no longer be before Judge Boasberg. That doesn't mean there wasn't contempt, right? And there's actually, I mean, Greg, as you know, right, there's a decent amount of precedent out there for the notion that you can commit contempt of court even if the court ultimately didn't have the power to resolve the case. Right? You can't be saved from contempt by the fact that, like, while you were cursing out the judge, you were making a legal argument that was technically correct. Right? I think the question, Greg, is less about his power and more about what he wants to do. And it seems to me that if I were Chief Judge Boasberg, I would take much the same approach at this point that Judge Dale Ho took in the Adams case, which is, not picking a fight with my appellate brethren over my ability to hang on to a case that I no longer really have, but making a statement for the historical record. Writing an opinion that says the government did not show cause. I believe that they committed contempt, but because of the Supreme Court's intervention, I'm not going to actually hold them in contempt. It wouldn't shock me if that's where this ended. On the sort of gosh, the broader question. Sorry, just remind me really quickly, what was the broader question? Because I'm losing my mind.
About the ability of the bar to take action.
Yes, sorry. Yeah,
no, fine.
Right. So, I mean, Greg, look, I think we have known for years that the bars of different states have done not nearly enough to hold lawyers accountable for misbehaving, and that's been especially true for government lawyers. I think it is worth conversations about how to change that. And maybe that starts with picking some of the most aggressive misrepresentations we can find from government lawyers, and referring them to their local and state bars. Um, I'm really sort of nervous about what happened with the suspension of Erez Ruveni, right, for having the temerity to sort of be candid to the tribunal in the Abrego Garcia case. So, Greg, I guess my response is like I would love to see more aggressive policing by state bars of federal government lawyers. There are structural reasons that you know as well as anyone historically why that hasn't happened. But maybe it's time to make some new law on the subject.
Well, I had a case
Thanks.
years ago in front of Judge Easterbrook where he sent opposing counsel to not a government lawyer, but led to massive problems for this guy who had taken very improper steps.
Well, and I'll just say, really, I mean, Jamie, really quickly, the federal government has at various points taken the position that its lawyers can't be subject to state disciplinary proceedings when they're representing the federal government. That just can't be true. But it might actually be high time to establish that as a matter of precedent.
So we got a couple minutes left, so I'm going to give you a couple of big questions you have to answer within 2 minutes.
Okay.
So just sort of rapid fire, what are the cases we should be on the lookout for in the Supreme Court in the coming months?
I mean, I would say in the coming days. So what happens in Abrego Garcia, I think, is really important, and we'll have a lot to. This is the guy who was wrongly removed to El Salvador, and we'll have a lot to say about just how important the Alien Enemy Act decision was. Like, if federal courts can still supervise what's happening, even once folks have been removed, I think that mitigates some of the costs. I think if the court doesn't reject the Trump administration's applications in the birthright citizenship cases, that's a really ominous sign because I think that should have been the easiest case out of all of them for Trump to lose. But Jamie, the sort of the larger point, there are more of these cases coming in this emergency posture. And so just folks paying attention to the nerdy technical stuff the court is doing in these cases in lieu of the normal attention we pay to the cases that get the full 9 yards of process.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that. And then the final thing, obviously, and I don't want to sound like I'm just your publicist, but obviously signing up for your Substack and paying attention to these things. I mean, listen, that's the one thing that Trump has done is people now care about lower elections that go up and down the ballot. I mean, people didn't care about those elections or the Supreme Court justices. That just wasn't the topic of conversation. Now it's become that. But are there any other things that we can do, the average citizen? We can send donuts to the law firms. We can pay attention to elections. But what else can we be really doing?
So honestly, I mean, I really mean this. Like, have these conversations with your friends and your family members, right? I mean, I have found a remarkable amount of disengagement from people who are smart enough to be engaged and just pushing the folks around you to talk about what's happening and talk about why what's happening matters and not let them off the hook. Like, that's what we all should be doing, no matter what else we're doing in our professional lives.
I love that because I think that is so important across the board. I think I always talk about people, like if you can just do one thing a day, we're going to reach that world that we're all sort of striving for. And that could be just having a conversation with a friend. It could be reading an article. It could be voting. It could be donating money. It could be whatever it is. But if you're just doing something and even having that dialogue, I love that you highlight that. Steve, thank you so much. I know you're burning the candles at both ends right now. Hopefully your students are helping you out in your class. Maybe you need some help and support. Don't do it all yourself. And I really, by the way, you really are a real Mets fan. As I look through your background there, you have the 1986 poster wrapped up there. You have the OMG sign. I mean, you're really, I might start rooting for the Mets just to make you happy. So,
I'll take every little thing I can, Jamie.
Thanks a lot. Everybody, we have, Jocelyn Benson coming up soon, who's in our first Meet the Candidates section, is running for governor. Is a new podcast that I'm going to be launching. And then Adam Kinzinger will be joining us the week after. So look out for that. Love seeing everybody. See you soon. Bye.
Bye, everybody.